Hello, friends. This week we're reading and reflecting together on chapter 3 of Michael Curry's book, Love is the Way, Holding On to Hope in Troubling Times. Chapter 3 is titled Making Do and Making New. And the question he poses to us is this: how do I find the energy to keep loving when the world seems to be going the other way? Indeed, a timely and relevant question. He opens the chapter by citing Zora Neale Hurston, the Harlem Renaissance writer of the 20th century. In a book she wrote, Dust Tracks on a Road, she talks about being in sorrow's kitchen and licking all the pots clean. It's a very vivid description of someone who's endured so much trial, so much suffering, so much disquiet. And Michael Curry poses the question to us: how do we do this? How do we make do and make new rather, in a world where things seem to be going the other way, and indeed we're not accomplishing God's dream as quickly as we would like? For him, the answer comes in his grandmother's kitchen. He paints this very vivid portrait of him as a boy, him and his sister and cousin Ronald, sitting there watching their grandmother cook, smelling all the beautiful smells of that kitchen, and listening to her tell stories, in particular stories of growing up. Her father was a sharecropper. Her grandparents were slaves in the Carolinas. They'd moved up to Buffalo, New York, which was now home, but he can very vividly remember his grandmother's posture and cooking abilities and her stories. Nellie Strayhorn was her name. So he talks about this phrase that she often used: we made do. We made do, as in we did the best we could. We sought to survive and then thrive. And she didn't say it in anger or in bitterness, which she had plenty of justification to do so. She said it in hope. She said it in steadiness. She said it in integrity and even in joy. He talks about this other phrase, to make it stretch. You know, folks like Michael Curry and his ancestors had to do the best they could with the last cuts of meat, the inexpensive vegetables, the highly starched foods. In fact, he talks about soul food becoming a cuisine because of the fact that people of color were so economically dispossessed, but that they had to sort of make do and stretch thin out of stuff that was not ideal at first, but then making something beautiful out of something less desirable. He wants to give a caveat, though, that making do is not the same as giving up or just giving in to the status quo. Making do is about a way of figuring out how to both survive and thrive in a really difficult environment. He talks about it as molding and making, taking what is old, what is given, what is, and making something new out of it, taking an old reality and creating a new possibility, as it were. He even says to make garbage into gourmet, this almost mystical transformation. He talks about the story of the burning bush in Exodus 3 a little bit, and then dives into these three ingredients as he sees it for making do, using this imagery of his grandmother's kitchen. So the three ingredients he discusses: first, ingredient number one is tradition. Tradition, not just the kind of things in a dusty attic, but tradition as in the testimony of lives well lived and the wisdom that had been passed on from one generation to the next. That, you know, cooks don't create out of nothing. They've been taught things by previous generations, read them in books, and so on and so forth. So drawing in tradition as this treasure chest of wisdom gleaned from human beings who have dared in the past to walk with God despite all circumstances. So that's ingredient number one that helps us make do, the influence of tradition that we all walk in. Ingredient number two is imagination. Imagination. He talks about Michelangelo seeing a sculpture and saying it's already complete when he looks at a granite stone. But of course, before he picks up his chisel, he has to be able to see that sculpture inside the big block of granite. And that's exactly what it took, a remarkable imagination from one of the greatest creators who's ever lived. Michael Curry talks about his grandmother being an expert at reframing. He was griping one day about there being some mold in a peach that he'd found in her kitchen, and she reminded him, they invented penicillin from mold. This very powerful reframe. And so she tells him, just cut out the mold and eat the rest. He also talks about the story of Jesus. Unless you change and become like little children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. He really thinks what Jesus is talking about there is imagination, the capacity to see a different future than the current present we're all enduring. Ingredient number 3, and lastly, is God. God primarily as a possibility of a different future. God as a given in our lives, and God as something that can empower us to see, again, a different future. He talks about prayer being not something like magic, but prayer being something like just bringing God into the equation of our lives. When we do that, something changes. Another possibility emerges. So in the end, friends, he encourages us, Reverend Curry does, to hold on to hope and trust that hope in God, hope in imagination, hope in tradition will bring altered futures, will bring new possibilities into our midst. It actually reminded me of something I read several months ago, and maybe even preached about this past year, that Bryan Stevenson wrote, the civil rights activist and lawyer and author. He talks about hope as our superpower. Hope as our superpower, this capacity for human beings, by God's good grace, to imagine a different future and not be content with the world as we've ordered it, but again, to push forward and live into God's dream, a true hope of what could be. So friends, that's chapter 3, and that's the question I would leave you with, Bryan Stevenson's call to lean into God's hope and to view it even as a superpower that we all have, as we all strive to make do and make new in this world in which we find ourselves, and this season in which we find ourselves, emerging out of the pandemic. How can you receive God's hope and strive to both make do and make new day in and day out? Grateful to be on the journey with you, friends. Peace be with you.